Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica and our continuing series, the Unported playlist, where we take a look at 21 of my favorite arcade games that were never given home ports. And today we're taking a look at SpikeOut Final Edition, released in 1999 by Sega on the Model 3 Step 2.1 hardware. Obviously Sega has a big lineage on arcade beat-em-ups, and SpikeOut's no different, but I'm really shocked that this didn't come home for two reasons. One, it's an awesome game, and two, it took me an hour and 40 minutes to beat this game from start to finish, so it seems like it was always destined for a home port because most arcade games do not last over half an hour, maybe an hour at the most if it's a long game. Granted, this game is quite difficult and it will take you a little bit to beat it. It is quite cheap in spots, but it definitely feels like it was intended for a console release because it is one of the most fully fleshed out arcade games as far as length is concerned that I've ever played. Now, I know they brought Die Hard home to the Dreamcast, Dynamite Deka 2, and that is also a great game. And I understand that Sega had issues porting Model 3 games over to the Dreamcast. Naomi was a lot more direct route, because even though technically Dreamcast may be as powerful as the Model 3, the architecture is completely different. So porting them over definitely was going to be difficult, and I could understand maybe not wanting to remake the game from the ground up. But I think if Sega had tried to port this over and done the work themselves and not kind of farmed it out to another developer, it could have been something that was ported over and it would have been a great game because SpikeOut is super fun. All of the impacts from the hits, all of the fighting, it's classic Sega and they're doing a great job with it. So it's really unfortunate that the game didn't get ported home. You will notice that there are a few graphical glitches in the skybox there, because on the Supermodel emulator you are able to force 16:9, and SpikeOut is one of the few games that has some issues with the skybox when doing that. But I enjoy playing in 16:9, so I'd rather look at those tiny little texture glitches than have to play in 4:3. If you're the opposite, just turn it on to 4:3 mode and the game runs perfectly fine and no slowdown, no glitches really. It's never crashed on me once, so it's a really easy game to play. Because if you do want to collect a Model 3 board, they're pretty complex. You have to deal with a filter board, you have to deal with powering it. It's not standard JAMA, so having it in your home is definitely a commitment. It's not too bad at the point where you'd want to avoid it if you love this game, but it's definitely a lot more difficult than just plugging a JAMA board into a super gun. And now that we're at the first boss, I will say that SpikeOut can definitely feel cheap at times. Once you have like 5 or 6 enemies surrounding you, they're just gonna wail away on you until you're dead. It doesn't have that classic like kung fu movie feel to it where there's 10 enemies but they all attack at once. This is more real life fighting where if there's 10 enemies, they're going to surround you and they're going to try to destroy you. You get these little bits of story in between levels, but honestly the story doesn't matter, it's not great, the fighting is why you're here, and that's definitely worth it. But I just wanted to show you guys a little bit of the story because you do get something, and it definitely feels like it was kind of trying to be a console release, arcade first and then coming home, and that's the disappointing part, is that you're not really going to find this game in arcades anymore. I haven't seen a Model 3 cabinet for probably like 5, 6, 7 years now, and I only played the original SpikeOut, not Final Edition, so I've never actually played this particular release in arcades. It just has some additions to the game, but generally it's kind of the final version of it. But the series did continue. There is SlashOut, which is more of a fantasy-themed version of this game. Again, it didn't get ported over, but Sega has used this franchise moving forward, but honestly 90% of it's never been ported home, which is a bit of a disappointment, because I would buy this today if they released it on a disc or as a downloadable title. I'd absolutely pay $10 and be able to play this in the comfort of my own home from my couch. I think it's definitely worth it, and it's something that people would really enjoy because the soundtrack's great, the fighting's great, it has that classic Model 3 look to it. And I know we've covered other Model 3 games on the channel, but I can't stress enough how much I love this version of 3D. This to me is when 3D was at its pinnacle when I was a kid. I remember going into arcades and looking at Model 3 things and thinking graphics possibly couldn't get any better than this. And granted, they did, but when I look at this still feels to me like the perfect version of 3D. Had games never evolved past this and they just continued to use Model 3 hardware up until today, I think I still would really enjoy it. But it just depends how old you are, when you grew up. I mean, maybe if you were 10 in 2005, PlayStation 2 looks like the version of 3D that you remember. And now we're with another boss, and you'll see here that we're just going to kind of get hammered on. You get juggled. The game can definitely feel pretty cheap. I put in a lot of virtual credits into this, and if I'd played it in the arcades, I definitely would have never finished it, because I think I probably spent enough money to buy this if it was a $60 game, in those fake credits I put in. What I want to let you do is watch a little bit of the gameplay on its own. You can hear the soundtrack, you can hear the sound effects, but I'll come back in a minute or so and we'll talk a little bit more about SpikeOut. But you'll see there again, got juggled, lost another credit. I do love the textures in the grass and the hedge images too. I know they're blurry, but like I said before, to me, this just feels right. And the Model 3 was definitely a special piece of arcade hardware. It's when Sega was at, to me, their peak. They were developing hardware that no one had seen before. They were partnering with people like Lockheed Martin, an aircraft and weapons developer, to make these sort of boards. So the things that Sega was doing in the 90s, just to me, scream pure nostalgia, and they scream a company that really knew what they were doing. And sadly, while Sega's still around and I still love them, they're definitely not the same company that was making things like the Model 3 hardware or games like SpikeOut, and I wish they'd kind of get back to that more, because this opera house, the patterns on the rug, the designs on the wall, all the enemies, what they're wearing, it all just really builds a cohesive world that, while it's cartoony and comical, it definitely feels real in its own way. But I definitely can't recommend playing the game enough. Like I said, the Supermodel emulator is, I think, best in its class as far as ease of use for emulators. It's really simple to install. If you use the graphical user interface, 3 clicks and you're playing the game. So there's no reason not to play this, especially if you like beat 'em ups, because if you haven't played it in arcades, you're probably never going to play a home port of it, because it seems like Sega just does not like giving us their classic arcade games. On the downside, like I said before, the game is incredibly cheap, and I'm playing it on default difficulty. I like playing each game on the difficulty the board shipped from to see what Sega thought would be the way to play it, and I will say that I would definitely turn the difficulty way down if I was playing this just for casual fun. I do like these screen transitions here, where that opera stage opens up to a pit. There's a lot of different stylistic elements put into the game, and now you have these kind of like gothic characters that you have to fight. And while there hasn't really been any fantasy setting into it so far, you will notice the boss here is able to levitate, so there's something going on behind the scenes. There's a little bit of otherworldliness, but not so much that it just becomes a fantasy game. But like I said, they do have a fantasy version of this, so if you're more into that genre, you definitely can check that out as well. But it's 100% worth playing, especially if you're not putting quarters in, because I will tell you, if I was paying for this in the arcades, I would have stopped at like $3 and thought the game was too hard. Playing it at home makes a big difference. But now we're moving on to the final boss. I'm not going to show you the end, but I will upload a full playthrough of this game, even though it does take over an hour and 40 minutes from start to finish. But I will say, as far as arcade bosses are concerned, this has got to be one of the cheapest experiences I have ever dealt with. He just mops the floor with you. But short of that, that is SpikeOut. Really appreciate you guys watching. If you could do us a huge favor, go down below and hit like and subscribe. It takes us a lot of time to make each one of these episodes, and your support really helps us out. But we will be back on Tuesday and Friday with more episodes in those series, and we'll be back on Sunday with an episode in the Unported playlist. But thanks so much for watching, guys. Like I said, this boss is just the absolute worst. That mouth texture is pretty gross too. But hey, the final bosses are always difficult, so you really can't expect too much. Short of that, we hope you enjoyed watching, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you back here on Sunday for another Unported episode. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.